January 1943. 30,000 feet above central Germany, the sky is unnaturally clear. A German fighter pilot tightens his gloved hand around the control stick. The engine vibrates through the airframe. Ahead, white contrails stretch across the blue like scars that refuse to fade. They do not scatter. They do not dive for cloud cover. They hold their course. Below him, the countryside is frozen and distant. Villages look like scale models. Rivers shine like steel wire. And in the center of it all, a formation unlike anything he has seen before. Dozens of four-engine bombers, boxed tightly together, flying straight into defended airspace in broad daylight. In earlier years, bombers turn away. They broke formation. They scattered under attack. These do not, even as flak blossoms around them, even as fighters circle for position, the formation holds. One aircraft is burning. Another has an engine stopped. Still, they remain inside the box. The German pilot has been taught that courage breaks under pressure. That machines fail. That men panic. But these American crews keep coming. Later, back on the ground, reports will be written. Words will be chosen carefully. Not propaganda, not praise, just observations. Because something unfamiliar has appeared in the sky over Germany, and the Luftwaffe is beginning to take notice. Before the Americans arrived in force, the men of the Luftwaffe believed they already understood aerial war. They had learned it in fragments across Europe, one campaign at a time. In September 1939, over Poland, German pilots met an opponent whose air force collapsed in days. In the West in 1940, over France and the Low Countries, they flew with near total freedom. French aircraft were brave, but scattered. Coordination was poor. Command structures failed under pressure. Victory came quickly, reinforcing the idea that speed, aggression, and individual skill decided everything. Then came Britain. During the Battle of Britain, German pilots encountered resistance that did not break. The Royal Air Force fought defensively, rotating squadrons, protecting its pilots, absorbing losses while preserving structure. The Luftwaffe did not lose because its pilots were inferior. It lost because air war had become systemic. Radar, command, logistics, endurance. Still, many German pilots walked away with a familiar conclusion. Skill in the cockpit mattered most, and when matched evenly, Germans believed they still held the edge. On the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942, that belief hardened. Against Soviet forces, early Luftwaffe dominance was overwhelming. Soviet pilots flew outdated aircraft. Training was rushed. Losses were catastrophic. German aces accumulated victories at unprecedented rates. Individual tallies soared into the hundreds. The idea of the lone expert, the skilled hunter in the sky, became central to Luftwaffe identity. German air doctrine reflected this experience. Pilots were trained to think independently, to hunt individually or in small formations. Success was measured in aircraft destroyed, not formations disrupted. Tactical flexibility was prized. Initiative was sacred. The Luftwaffe produced exceptional aviators, but it did not produce them in large numbers, and it did not rotate them out of combat. Experience was hoarded in the cockpit, not distributed across the force. This system worked brilliantly as long as the enemy broke. Bomber crews were expected to panic. Formations were expected to disintegrate under attack. Defensive gunners were considered secondary threats. The prevailing belief was simple: apply pressure at the right angle, and human fear would do the rest. Even British heavy bombers, flying mostly at night, were viewed through this lens. When German pilots did encounter them, they were large, vulnerable targets, dangerous, yes, but not disciplined in daylight combat. Daylight bombing itself was considered outdated, even reckless. The Luftwaffe had largely abandoned it after suffering losses earlier in the war. So when intelligence reports in 1942 began describing American aircraft formations preparing for daylight operations, many German officers were skeptical. Four-engine bombers flying in tight groups, without fighter escort, over Germany, in daylight. The assumption was not that it would be dangerous, but that it would be short-lived. German planners believed such raids would collapse once real resistance was encountered. Losses would be unsustainable. Crews would refuse missions. Morale would crack. That was how air war had worked before. What the Luftwaffe did not yet grasp was that the Americans were not entering the war with the same assumptions or the same philosophy. Their doctrine did not rely on individual brilliance. It relied on structure, repetition, and collective endurance. At first, German pilots only saw fragments: a distant formation, a brief engagement, a single bomber refusing to turn back. Nothing that demanded a rewrite of doctrine. Nothing that challenged long-held beliefs. But those fragments were accumulating, and soon they would no longer be possible to ignore, because the Americans were not just appearing at the edges of German airspace. They were coming straight through the center of it. By the summer of 1942, the Americans were no longer an abstraction. They arrived first in planning rooms and intelligence summaries, then in reconnaissance photographs, and finally in the air itself. The force behind them was the United States Army Air Forces, and its most visible instrument in Europe was the 8th Air Force. Unlike the British, who had turned to night bombing after heavy early losses, the Americans arrived with a doctrine they refused to abandon: precision daylight bombing, conducted in mass, without initial long-range fighter escort. To German planners, this bordered on delusion. Daylight over Germany meant flying directly into the most concentrated air defense network in the world. Radar-guided fighters, dense anti-aircraft artillery, well-drilled interceptor units, no cloud cover to hide behind, no darkness to confuse gunners. Every assumption suggested catastrophic losses. Early encounters seemed to confirm it. In late 1942 and early 1943, small American formations probed deeper into occupied Europe. Losses were heavy. German pilots reported bombers falling in flames, tumbling out of formation, crews bailing out over hostile territory. To many in the Luftwaffe, this was simply the expected outcome of an unsustainable idea. Initial German combat reports described American crews as rigid and predictable. Their formations were tight, their flight paths straight. They did not maneuver aggressively. They did not scatter. They flew as if following a script. But embedded in those same reports was something more unsettling. The bombers did not break. German pilots were accustomed to seeing panic ripple through formations once the first aircraft was hit. With American bombers, damage accumulated. Engines failed, control surfaces were shredded, fuselages burned, yet the formations held shape far longer than expected. Gunners continued firing even when aircraft were visibly crippled. Crews stayed in position even as flak bursts tore holes through wings and tails. The Germans noted this, not emotionally, clinically. Fighter units adjusted tactics. Head-on attacks were emphasized to reduce exposure to defensive fire. New firing angles were tested. Specialized weapons were introduced. The Luftwaffe adapted quickly, but adaptation itself was evidence that something was wrong with the old assumptions. The true shock came in 1943, when American bombers struck deep into Germany, not just industrial outskirts, but core production centers. The scale changed overnight. Raids against targets like Schweinfurt, Regensburg missions forced German pilots into sustained combat against formations numbering in the hundreds. What they saw at close range contradicted years of experience. American crews flew in standardized boxes that overlapped fields of fire. Every bomber protected the others. Attacking one aircraft meant entering the killing zone of several more. Losses mounted not only among bombers, but among German fighters. Pilots began reporting something they had rarely admitted before: fear. Not fear of individual opponents, but of the system itself. Of a formation that absorbed punishment without collapsing. Of crews who did not disengage even when survival instincts demanded it. Of an enemy that replaced losses faster than Germany could train pilots. The Luftwaffe was still confident, still aggressive, still lethal, but its pilots were now writing reports that sounded different. They no longer asked whether American bombing would continue. They asked how long Germany could endure it, because the Americans were not learning how to fight like Germans. They were forcing the Germans to fight on American terms, and the consequences of that shift were only beginning to emerge. German fighter pilots were trained to dismantle formations. The method was precise. Approach from a blind angle. Deliver a short burst. Break away before defensive fire converged. It was a technique refined over years of combat, built on the assumption that bomber formations were fragile under pressure. Against the Americans, that assumption collapsed. Combat reports began to describe something unprecedented: overlapping fire. Every approach vector was covered. Head-on attacks, once considered the safest method, turned into races through dense streams of tracer fire. Pilots reported canopies shattered, engines hit, control lines severed, often before they could fire a single effective burst. What unsettled German tacticians most was not the firepower itself, but its consistency. American formations did not loosen when attacked. They tightened. Gaps were closed automatically. Damaged aircraft were absorbed back into the box when possible. The system did not depend on one pilot's skill or initiative. It functioned even when individuals were wounded or killed. 4 German pilots trained as hunters. This was disorienting. Skill mattered less when every target was protected by several others. Attacking one aircraft meant exposing oneself to many. Losses began to rise in ways that could not be dismissed as bad luck. The Luftwaffe responded with innovation, heavier weapons, new attack formations, specialized interceptor units, but each adjustment was reactive. The Americans were not adapting to German tactics. German pilots were adapting to American structure. And structure, once established, proved far harder to break than any individual aircraft. What German pilots noticed first was not courage. It was refusal. They expected bomber crews to abandon damaged aircraft quickly, to break formation to save themselves, to prioritize survival over mission. That had been the pattern before. American crews did not behave that way. Reports describe bombers flying level with entire sections of wing missing, engines on fire, control surfaces barely responding. Yet crews stayed in formation until the last possible moment, sometimes until the aircraft simply could not remain airborne. This was not interpreted as recklessness. German pilots understood risk. They respected it. What unsettled them was the absence of visible hesitation. American gunners stayed at their weapons even as fighters closed in. Pilots held course under flak that would have forced others to evade. Damage accumulated without visible panic. Some German pilots wrote that American crews appeared mechanical. Others described them as unyielding. None suggested they were afraid. This forced an uncomfortable realization. Fear had always been a weapon. Break morale, and machines followed. With American bomber crews, fear did not function as expected. Whether through training, discipline, or belief in a mission, these crews absorbed punishment without the emotional collapse German doctrine depended upon. The effect was cumulative. German pilots began entering combat already anticipating resistance that would not give way. The psychological advantage they once enjoyed, the expectation of control, eroded with every encounter. The Americans were not superior pilots in the traditional sense, but they were something the Luftwaffe had not prepared for. An enemy whose human limits were reinforced by organization rather than tested by it. And as these encounters multiplied, respect, reluctant, unspoken, began to replace dismissal. German pilots trusted engineering. They flew aircraft designed for speed, climb, and precision. Machines were tools, sharp, elegant, and expendable. American bombers challenged that understanding. The aircraft most often mentioned in German combat reports was the B-17 Flying Fortress. At first glance, it was slow and ungainly. It did not outmaneuver fighters. It did not dive away. It simply kept flying. What disturbed German pilots was how much punishment it could absorb. Engines destroyed, yet the aircraft stayed aloft. Fuselages torn open, yet structural integrity held. Control cables severed, yet redundancy compensated. Gunners killed or wounded, yet remaining positions continued firing. German engineers analyzed wreckage with professional curiosity. They noted armor placement, fuel tank protection, redundant systems. The bomber was not invulnerable, but it was designed to survive damage long enough to complete the mission. This durability altered the balance of risk. Every interception required German fighters to remain exposed longer, to stay inside defensive fire while delivering repeated attacks. The bomber's endurance forced the fighter into a war of attrition it could not afford. Pilots began reporting frustration rather than confidence. Not because they could not shoot bombers down. They could, but because destroying one aircraft no longer guaranteed disruption of the formation or the mission. The machine itself had become part of the American doctrine, and it worked. German air culture elevated the ace. Experience remained in the cockpit. Veterans stayed in combat until killed or incapacitated. Skill accumulated vertically, not horizontally. The system produced extraordinary individuals, but it depended on their survival. American air units operated differently. German observers noted that American pilots and crews rotated more frequently. Training was standardized. Procedures were rigid. Individual improvisation was limited by design. At first, this was interpreted as weakness. But over time, Luftwaffe commanders began recognizing the advantage. Losses could be absorbed without collapse. Replacement crews arrived with consistent training. Tactics remained stable even as personnel changed. German pilots began facing formations flown by crews who behaved identically mission after mission. The enemy did not evolve unpredictably. It endured predictably. That predictability became a strength. German pilots could anticipate American behavior, but anticipating it did not make it easier to defeat. The Americans did not rely on exceptional talent. They relied on repetition, discipline, and scale. And scale favored them. The Luftwaffe did not romanticize the Americans. They criticized bombing accuracy. They noted rigid flight paths. They dismissed American fighter pilots early in the war as inexperienced. But within bomber combat reports, a new tone emerged. Professional respect stripped of emotion. American crews were described as determined, organized, difficult to intimidate, not fearless, not reckless, but unwilling to yield. This distinction mattered. German pilots understood bravery. They lived with it daily. What unsettled them was encountering an opponent whose courage was institutional rather than personal, embedded in systems rather than personalities. The Americans did not fight to win duels. They fought to complete missions. And as German losses mounted and American formations kept returning, that realization settled into the Luftwaffe's collective understanding. Something fundamental had shifted in the air war. And the moment of reckoning, when acknowledgement turned into inevitability, was approaching fast. By late 1943, the tone of German air war reporting had changed. There was less speculation, less dismissal, more calculation. American raids were no longer isolated thrusts. They were sustained pressure, mission after mission, week after week, and not just at factories, but at the Luftwaffe itself. This shift became explicit with Operation Point Blank, the combined Allied campaign designed to destroy German fighter production and, more critically, German pilots. For Luftwaffe commanders, the danger was no longer theoretical. Every large American raid forced German fighters into combat whether conditions favored them or not. Fuel was burned climbing to altitude. Aircraft were worn down. Pilots were exposed repeatedly to concentrated defensive fire. Losses accumulated not in dramatic collapses, but in steady erosion. German pilots felt the change first. They were flying more often for longer hours, against formations that grew larger with each passing month. American bomber streams stretched across the sky, their boxes layered vertically and horizontally, creating depth that earlier formations lacked. Attacking them required coordination, timing, and luck was running out. Then came February 1944. In a single week of sustained operations later known as Big Week, American bombers return again and again, striking aircraft factories, assembly plants, and airfields across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them every time because it had no choice. The results were devastating. German pilots were shot down in numbers that could not be replaced. Veterans died alongside newly trained replacements. Units that once relied on experienced leaders found themselves led by men with only a handful of combat hours. And yet the Americans kept coming. What made this phase unbearable for German pilots was not just the bombers. It was what now flew with them. Long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, shattered one of the Luftwaffe's last advantages. American fighters no longer turned back at the edge of Germany. They stayed. They hunted. They followed German aircraft back to their airfields. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots were vulnerable not just over targets, but throughout the entire mission cycle, during climb, interception, disengagement, and landing. German pilot accounts from this period are blunt. They describe exhaustion, shortages of fuel, aircraft grounded for lack of parts, training hours cut to dangerous minimums. Pilots entering combat knowing they were outmatched not in skill, but in numbers and endurance. Most revealing are the assessments of American pilots during this phase. German reports no longer questioned their competence. Instead, they noted their aggressiveness, their coordination with bombers, their relentless pursuit. American pilots were described as confident, not reckless, but assured that the system behind them would carry losses and continue. The Luftwaffe still fought, but now it fought defensively, reacting rather than shaping events. The air war over Germany had reached a point where outcomes were no longer decided by individual engagements, but by attrition, and attrition favored the Americans. For many German pilots, this was the moment the truth became unavoidable. The air war was no longer winnable, and what followed would confirm that realization with brutal clarity. By the spring of 1944, the German skies had grown thin. Not empty, but fragile. The Luftwaffe still possessed capable aircraft. It still fielded pilots with skill and experience. But the balance that once defined aerial combat had vanished. The Americans had solved the problem the Germans could not: how to fight continuously, absorb losses, and return in greater strength the next day. German pilots now encountered American formations that behaved with absolute confidence. Bombers flew deeper than ever before. Fighters roamed freely. Escort formations broke away not defensively, but offensively, seeking combat rather than avoiding it. German pilots rode of American fighters waiting above airfields, attacking as aircraft took off or landed, exploiting moments of maximum vulnerability. This was psychologically devastating. The Luftwaffe had always relied on controlled engagement, choosing when and where to fight. Now the Americans dictated tempo. Missions became defensive scrambles rather than planned interceptions. Fuel shortages forced pilots to conserve throttle, limiting pursuit. Training deficits meant inexperienced pilots flew alongside veterans who could no longer protect them. In reports and interrogations from 1944 and early 1945, German pilots began speaking openly about American airmen in terms that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. They called them methodical. They called them persistent. They described them as pilots who trusted their systems completely and were therefore willing to press attacks others would abandon. One German fighter leader wrote that American pilots fought without visible concern for loss, not because they were indifferent to death, but because they believed replacement was guaranteed and mission success inevitable. This belief was correct. The Luftwaffe could no longer replace pilots fast enough. Aircraft sat idle for lack of fuel. Squadrons that once flew multiple sorties per day were grounded. Commanders ordered pilots into combat knowing survival odds were collapsing, but retreat was no longer an option. American pilots noticed the change as well. Encounters became shorter. Resistance thinned. German attacks lost coordination. Some German pilots disengaged early. Others fought desperately. Many never returned. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's presence over Germany was sporadic. American bombers flew with fewer losses. Escort fighters dominated the airspace from takeoff to landing. The system the Germans had once studied, criticized, and dismissed now ruled the sky. In the final weeks of the war, German pilots who survived no longer wrote combat reports with tactical analysis. They wrote assessments. They acknowledged that American pilots were not superior because they were braver, faster, or more skilled individually, but because they were backed by an industrial, organizational, and doctrinal engine that could not be stopped from the air. The reckoning was complete. What remained was not bitterness, but recognition, and soon reflection. The war in the air over Germany ended not with a single climactic battle, but with a gradual thinning of resistance. By mid-1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Airfields lay in ruins. Aircraft production had been shattered. Fuel supplies were almost non-existent. Pilots who remained were exhausted, demoralized, and aware that the tide had turned irreversibly. German pilots who survived to surrender were interrogated by the Allies, producing some of the most candid assessments of American aircrews during the war. In these reports, recurring themes appeared: respect for the Americans' discipline, endurance, and operational coordination. One Luftwaffe officer noted that while American pilots lacked the individual flamboyance of a Luftwaffe ace, they flew with a cohesion and stubbornness that was impossible to counter once fully engaged. The aftermath was not only tactical, but psychological. For the first time, German airmen acknowledged an enemy whose effectiveness stemmed less from extraordinary individual skill and more from systematic preparation and institutional resilience. The Americans did not rely on improvisation, nor did they falter when a pilot fell. Their formations adapted. They recovered. They persisted. Daily logs and memoirs reveal how Luftwaffe units came to understand this slowly. A pilot writing after the war recalled attacking a B-17 flying fortress formation over northern Germany. Every plane we shot down seemed replaced by another that took its place. They came on no matter what we did. Another noted, "We realized that even when we won the fight, we did not win the war in the air. They simply returned tomorrow." These realizations marked a turning point in Luftwaffe morale. Where once confidence had come naturally, now caution, calculation, and dread governed every sortie. Commanders began instructing pilots less on individual initiative and more on survival tactics, how to engage, disengage, and live to fight another day. The human cost was steep. Losses among trained Luftwaffe personnel outpaced the replacement rate, and the pool of experienced pilots shrank dramatically. Yet amid these losses, respect for American aircrews persisted. German reports did not glorify their enemy, but acknowledged a simple truth. The Americans had mastered the art of sustained daylight bombing and escort tactics, and the Luftwaffe had been forced to adapt and ultimately failed. By the end of 1944, Luftwaffe pilots, riding from the front lines, had stopped underestimating their opponents. They no longer spoke of American crews as naive or inexperienced. They recognized a relentless operational discipline that German pilots had never faced in prior campaigns. The narrative of attrition and persistence was further reinforced by operational statistics. During the Big Week raids, Luftwaffe losses exceeded 400 aircraft in just 7 days, while American bombers completed over 1,000 sorties with significant but sustainable losses. The imbalance illustrated a new reality. Germany could not replace losses at the same rate, and the Americans could endure the very punishment the Luftwaffe had relied upon to break other air forces. The Germans had always understood the mechanics of war, who had numbers, who had skill, who had terrain. Now, for the first time, they faced an opponent whose strength lay in something both mechanical and human, a combination of disciplined pilots, resilient aircraft, and an unyielding doctrine that refused to break. Post-war reflections deepened the picture of German perceptions. Luftwaffe veterans, once proud of their individual prowess, now wrote candidly about American airmen in memoirs and interviews collected by Allied historians. They described crews who executed missions with near-mechanical precision, pilots who coordinated tightly with gunners, and fighter escorts who turned encounters into prolonged contests of attrition. One former squadron leader summarized it simply: they did not fight like men, they fought like a machine, and that machine never stopped. German pilots also acknowledged what they could not match: industrial endurance. No matter how many bombers fell, more replaced them within days. Fuel, parts, training, all replenished at a pace the Luftwaffe could no longer emulate. Experienced pilots perished faster than replacements could be trained. By 1944, German air power had become a fragile shell, a force incapable of contesting American dominance in the sky. Combat reports increasingly contained lines of resignation, notes on how many sorties a unit could fly, how many aircraft remained operational, how morale was fraying. Yet the respect for American crews persisted. They were described as disciplined rather than reckless, organized rather than improvisational, relentless rather than daring. German pilots noted that Americans did not seek glory in dogfights, nor did they rely on aces to decide battles. Their advantage lay in collective endurance, a quiet, systemic determination that overwhelmed the Luftwaffe over time. Even when losses were high, American formations completed missions, disrupted production, and returned in greater strength. This combination of human and organizational factors created a stark contrast to earlier wars, where Luftwaffe tactics and individual skill had dominated. The Americans' approach forced the Germans to confront an uncomfortable truth. The battlefield could be mastered not only through bravery or ingenuity, but through relentless, coordinated, and disciplined persistence. By 1945, few Luftwaffe pilots remained to oppose them. Airfields were abandoned, squadrons scattered. Germany's skies fell silent under the constant hum of Allied engines. Veterans reflected that their early dismissals of American airmen had been misguided, not out of arrogance alone, but because the Americans represented a type of warfare the Luftwaffe had never trained for. Their resilience had shifted the balance decisively, leaving a legacy that German pilots could neither ignore nor forget. And as Europe's conflict ended, these reflections set the stage for understanding the true nature of air combat. That skill, courage, and technology mattered, but so too did organization, endurance, and doctrine. For the Germans, the war in the air had been lost not to audacity, but to methodical, unyielding persistence. The story of German pilots confronting American airmen in World War II is a study in perception, adaptation, and the limits of individual skill. The Luftwaffe had long relied on exceptional pilots, flexible tactics, and decisive engagements to dominate the skies. They measured victory in aces, in daring maneuvers, in moments of personal brilliance. The Americans offered something different. They offered structure, discipline, collective endurance. Day after day, mission after mission, their formations absorbed punishment, pressed forward and completed objectives. Their success was not founded on individual heroism, but on repetition, coordination, and the resilience of both machine and man. For German pilots, respect grew from observation rather than admiration. They realized that courage alone could not overcome systems engineered to endure and persist. They recognized that technology was inseparable from doctrine, a bomber's durability, a fighter's range, a formation's cohesion, all reinforcing the enemy's operational advantage. This recognition left a subtle but profound mark. By the end of the war, Luftwaffe veterans no longer framed battles as contests of personal skill, but as clashes against an unyielding mechanism that combined human resolve with industrial might. The lesson was clear. Warfare is defined not just by audacity, but by preparation, coordination, and the ability to endure. In the silence after the engines stopped, in the empty skies over a defeated Germany, German pilots reflected on those Americans who had flown with quiet determination, unshaken by loss, relentless in purpose. Their words are not eulogies. They are acknowledgments of an enemy who changed the nature of air combat, and in doing so, reshaped history itself. The Americans did not fight to be feared. They fought to be unstoppable,